If you had a manga series that was about obsession, beauty, narcissism, and murder, and then that manga series started one person's career and then spanned most of the entirety of that career, you would have Tomie, and that artist would be Junji Ito. And like I said, Tomie really was the very first thing he ever had published. And boy, oh boy, does it show in the beginning of this. I'm not saying that it's bad. It's just really rough. And then to be honest, on the flip side of that, I really genuinely do enjoy seeing his art kind of grow and mature and evolve throughout the beginning of this, and it really does come into its own really, really quickly in the beginning. I don't know if that's because I would imagine that's obviously because he was not just writing this exclusively, he would have been working all over the place, but yeah, pretty quickly it comes into its own and it becomes Junji Ito, and let's be honest, he is amazing. I just love his work, I love his style, I really just like what he can do with a pen. It's really impressive. Now, Tomie itself is a kind of new experience for me, at least in terms of Junji Ito. And I don't have a ton of experience with him. This is only the fourth thing that I've ever read from him. But everything else that I have read has been like one cohesive story in like Uzumaki or Gyo or No Longer Human. It is one book that tells one story, and that's not what this is. This is kind of like a serialized, episodic little series of, they all contain the same main character, of course, being Tomie, but other than that, there are maybe stories that span a few chapters or take a couple of chapters to tell a story, but for the most part, it's very episodic, it's very kind of monster of the week, even though the monster of every week is the same monster, and that is Tomie, but it's just a different kind of experience to the other things that I have read from Junji Ito. And yes, you could make the argument that Uzumaki is also quite episodic in the way that it's presented, but it still has that same core set of characters that follows through the entire story and really does complete that through line by the end, whereas this absolutely does not. And then not only does this give this particular manga a different feel than the other ones that I've read, but it also gives him a little bit more freedom in this one. Freedom to just kind of do whatever the hell he wants, go wherever he wants to go, various locations, various characters, various different situations and scenarios, and really do a whole lot more with it with as like almost no rules. Like as few rules as humanly possible, and those rules are really only apply to Tomie herself and how she kind of works. And even then, sometimes it feels like we're just kind of going with it as we go through the book, and that's fine. That is genuinely one of the strengths of this, just that freedom that it gives him to kind of just go anywhere. And having said all that, it really did feel like in the beginning of the book, he was trying to tell a cohesive story, trying to keep the same characters, trying to keep it all connected and working. And it didn't feel great when he was trying to do that. And I think he realized that pretty quickly, and also pretty quickly ditched that plan to just the go anywhere, do anything idea. And then from then on out, he only carries characters over when he pretty much absolutely has to. And then, like I said, this is such an episodic kind of a book, but the stories that we're telling in this book are kind of like just real quick spotlights on humanity and the worst that humanity has to offer. Absolutely the deepest, darkest, ugliest underbelly of human nature. Highlighting jealousy, rage, murder, greed, narcissism, obsession with beauty, all of it. And he's going to use Tomie to be able to highlight all of these different horrible aspects of humanity. A lot of times they are coming directly from her because Tomie has a tendency to use people, abuse people, and take advantage of people, mostly men. She'll treat them terribly or manipulate them to the point where they brutally murder her. But then on the flip side of that, there's entire sections where she does seemingly nothing wrong, and still the worst comes out in people simply because they end up obsessing over her or just something. But for some reason, there is an absolute energy and an aura around this particular person that will bring out the absolute worst in humanity, men, women, everybody, to the point where they will ultimately end up brutally murdering her. And she seems, quite frank and honestly, to enjoy every bit of it. So at the end of the day, it really seems like a contemplation on the worst aspects of humanity in general, irrespective of who is necessarily at fault or who is to blame for the incidents that are happening at that point in the story, or at the very least, who is to blame or who is at fault. It definitely isn't the primary focus of the story. And I'm sure it's no coincidence that the figure and the root of all this madness and obsession and evil in this particular manga happens to be a beautiful female. Just the image in general of the succubus or some type of character like that has been a part of like human mythology for thousands of years. I don't know if there is actually a very specific like Japanese version or a version of this that is specific to Japanese culture. I don't know. But irregardless, that is pretty much simply a reason why this particular story can kind of go around the globe and kind of go anywhere to any people, and that image and that particular type of a creature is just ubiquitous around the world. It ultimately makes the book pretty universal, although I would argue Junji Ito and his art and the stories that he crafts and creates in general seem to be pretty universal. And that probably by extension isn't necessarily even so much a Junji Ito thing, because I think horror in general tends to be a pretty universal experience for humanity. You can take a horror movie from most cultures and transfer it to a different culture, and it almost always translates. There's something very deeply buried in us that makes us fearful of very specific things that tend to transcend cultures and peoples. Now, I will say, when it comes to the actual manga of Tomie, that with it being such a serialized and episodic kind of a book, not all of these are bangers. There's some stories in there where you're kind of rolling your eyes and you're just kind of like, oh my gosh. And actually, right after he breaks out of that mold in the beginning few chapters of trying to tell a cohesive story with cohesive characters, he kind of starts that episodic nature of it. And for a while, it feels like we kind of get stuck in this loop where we kind of tell the same story over and over again. And it's kind of really starts to dry up really quickly. And then all of a sudden he just breaks out of that mold, and that's when he really starts to go just wild with it and kind of really go different places and do different things. I don't know if he personally was realizing that it was getting stale or if he was just getting bored or what, but there is a tipping point where all of a sudden he just kind of goes crazy, and it becomes a lot more fun in the back half of the manga, I would say. And of course, we can't have a discussion about Junji Ito without discussing the art. I kind of keep saying how awesome he is, but let's just be real. His art is great. It's just so good. And I just love Junji Ito. He just has this real good way of touching on some real deep-seated, I don't know, fears that we have. At the very least, he's going to get right down into the nitty-gritty details of some really gruesome artwork. And then, of course, you've got whatever the fuck this thing is, which is, I know it's a very famous picture. I'm definitely not the first person to put this in a video. As a matter of fact, this is an image from Junji Ito that I had seen kind of circulating around the internet way before I ever even read my first book of his. And now I know where it belongs in his catalog, and it's just as weird and off-putting here in the context of the book as it was when I just saw it as a random picture floating around on the internet. But then, of course, beyond that one specific image, there's just this extremely wide array of just truly disturbing imagery. And that comes to the fact that he kind of has the freedom to kind of go wherever and do whatever he wants with this manga. And it kind of gives him the freedom to just kind of come up with really wild shit. And I love it. And then I do kind of want to go back to the stories real fast. I know I'm all over the place here, but going back to the stories, like I said, he abandons the carrying characters over, but he kind of brings it all home with this series of chapters where he kind of creates another through line, again, much shorter than the other one, but he creates this through line with this character who is obsessed with teaching Tomie a lesson. He's going to punish her by creating versions of her that can grow old, and then he's going to make sure she doesn't die or get hurt. So she has to grow old, and she has to suffer by losing the one thing that will hurt her the most, at least in his mind, and that is losing her beauty. And it just ends on this wonderful cliffhanger of him failing to do what he was trying to do, and he ends up growing old and essentially wasting his entire life on this vendetta that doesn't even work out for him. It's just the worst, most depressingly gruesome ending that we could possibly have. One of my absolute favorite, maybe my favorite, like standout story, individual story in the entire book. And it is the one that brings it home, and it's the one that ends the entire book. It was just, if we're going out with a banger, and we're going out on a high note. At least it did for me. I just thought it was great. And all in all, the entire experience from start to finish was quite enjoyable. Like I said, there were a few dips, a few low points, a few stories I didn't care for. But all in all, I thought it was a really genuinely good experience, a genuinely enjoyable experience. I don't know if it's like great. It's definitely no Uzumaki. But I would say if I had to give it a score, I'd probably give it a solid 8 out of 10. I think it was a really good time. And it's a great read for October, Halloween. You just want to, actually, you know what? Let's be honest. Junji Ito's probably a good experience any time of the year. Anyway, as always, everybody, the link for my Patreon's in the description below. The link for my Discord's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.